Thank you so much for joining, and it's an honor to have you close our conference. It's really, you're the most suitable person to do that, so thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me. This is really a treat. Let's see, get my first slide up, and
I'll get it. It's on my side, so no worries.
Okay. So, Artem, it's always important to challenge oneself, and so I want to preface that coming into this particular presentation, I said to myself, what is a new metaphor? What is something that I can do to challenge myself, to further perhaps my own ideas or insights? Where can I go that's new within this realm of storytelling? And so the power of images and metaphors is really so essential to this conversation about culture and about how we can expand our thinking. So let's see.
I'll just bring it up for you, and let's rock and roll then.
All right, let's do it. So you've been playing, of course, with fire, and I wanted to come with this idea around volts and story volts and electromagnetic. And I want to start even with an apology. The fact of the matter is I am not a scientist, and I'll do my best to actually take what are somewhat technical ideas and translate them in a way that we can apply them to stories and culture. So, we're looking at this whole notion of energy and how things happen in an organization, and what do we use in this analogy of electromagnetism to understand what story culture is and how we use stories to manage or to participate and co-create the cultures that we care about. So of course, Artem, I gotta begin with a bit of a story, and this story actually I took a minute and I wanted to understand if I could find, and this is very much on par with what Kat was just talking about, like how do we take a story and create applicability to the moment that we're in and to our listeners. And to me, storytelling is a lot about intentionality. And we're going to look at how intentionality with stories and cultures is very different than how we think of kind of traditional communication. So you can probably see a little bit here. This is my book of Russian storytelling. So I spent some time, and I wanted to find a story that I thought could ground in a way perhaps some of the things that we miss when we go about culture and apply storytelling in some of the traditional ways that people tend to think of storytelling. So this is a story called The Utter Fool. So imagine, if you will, a beautiful little village, and in this village lives a young man with his mother. And the young man goes out every day walking in the village and getting into kind of trouble because he's just an absolute fool. He doesn't know what comes out of his mouth, and by what he says, what kind of impact it's having on people around him. Does that sound familiar to culture? So one day he's out and he says, "Mom, I'm going to go for this little walk, and I wonder what I'm going to discover today." And as he's walking around, he finds some people carrying a coffin. And in the coffin, of course, there's a dead person, and they're all solemnly carrying the coffin, marching and processing through the village. And he decides that he wants to say something that will make a difference. So he says to the people carrying the coffin, "May you have to carry this coffin forever and ever." The people drop the coffin, and what do you expect that they do? They start beating on this poor fool. So he goes home to his mom, and he says, "Mom, I was out there, and I said to these people, may you have to carry your coffin forever and ever, and they beat me up. Look at all these bruises." And she said to him, "Well, next time, really what you should say in that situation is, may he rest in peace eternally," referring to the person, of course, in the coffin. May he rest in peace eternally. It's an expression that we use to provide comfort to those who are facing death. So he nods and says, "Okay, the next situation, I'm gonna say, may he rest in peace eternally." So he's out the next day. He says, "Mom, I'm gonna go out see what's happening in the village." She goes, "Okay." And as he's walking around, he sees a wedding procession. There's the bride and the groom, and everyone's all happy, and they're dancing around with their pipes and their music. And he says, "Oh, I know what to say now. I know what to say when I see a procession." So he walks up to the bride and the groom and the family, and he shouts to them, "May you rest in peace." And suddenly everybody starts beating on this poor fool, and he goes running off with just his head bleeding from the beating that he's taken from people upset with what he said. And he goes to his mom and he says, "Mom, I was out and there was this wedding procession, and I did what you told me to do. I said, may he rest in peace." And she said, "Oh, son, that was a wedding. At a wedding, it's different than a funeral. What you should have done is you should have danced and played your pipe for them. That would have been what was best in that wedding procession." And he goes, "Oh, okay. Thank you, Mom. I'll know what to do next time." So next day he's out again and he's wandering around, and he comes upon a farm, and the farm has a barn, and in the barn they store all the corn. And so he stops in front of the barn and decides that he's going to begin dancing and playing his reed pipe. I mean, that's what his mom said, if you see something going on in a situation, go and play your pipe and start dancing. Oh my gosh, when the people who own the farm came by and saw that he wasn't doing anything to put the fire out, they began to beat on him again, and the poor young man goes running away, totally confused, not understanding why this has happened. And he goes back to his mom, and his mom says, "You should have taken them, helped them with the fire and gotten some water and helped them to put it out. You should have just taken the water and poured it on the fire. That's what you should do in that situation." So, and young man says, Ma, you're so wise. I'm such a fool. Thank you." So he decides that he's going to go out and the next day again. And this time he runs across a family, and they've got their pig. An excuse for anyone who doesn't eat pork or anything. I mean, no offense by this, but he's got a pig on a roasting pit, and it's going around, and they're a nice big fire, and the pig is cooking just wonderfully. It's getting all nicely singed and whatnot. And he goes, "Oh, I know what to do to be kind and to be helpful. I'll go pour water all over the fire." So the poor fool pours water all over the fire, and you know what happens next. And the mother tells her son, "Don't ever go out again. You're only staying in this yard." Okay, so you can put the slides back up. Thanks. Why do I share a story like that, and what does that have to do with stories and culture? Well, I'll let you ponder it, but think about the fact of how often our messaging is always one step behind, how we're often out of sync, how in many ways we're fools even with the stories that we tell, even with how, and we can advance, I think, do I advance the slides? Yes, I do. I'm sorry, Artem, you taught me all this. We forget the fact that, often in our earnestness to find the right messages, putting up our posters, creating all the videos with the stories that are going to move the culture, we really forget that our messaging is often out of sync and is actually in many instances well-intentioned, like this poor fool, but not effective, right? So our universe is made of stories and not atoms. So let's try to break apart this metaphor that we're working with around story volt and electromagnetic. So if our universe is made of stories, then as Kat was talking about, really a lot of the story culturing that we're doing is around the listening, or is around actually how we're facilitating the sense making of others. And so if you see yourself as the organization, and here's your hand, and in your hand are these atoms, and every atom has protons and neutrons and electrons, and somehow there's this energy that all of these things are being held together. They're all having some dynamic relationship with one another. And your organization, or your facilitation within the organization, is noticing all of these atoms, all of these places in the organization where stories are happening. And what is the force of those stories, and how can those forces be unified in any kind of way so that there's positive movement into an emerging space? So if we think of culture as something as emerging, not something as static. We set static goals. We say next quarter we're going to grow by 10%. Do you really set static goals with culture? Think about that. Our cultural goals are really about movement. And that's really also the notion of stories. Again, Kat was drawing our attention. She talked about the wonderful work that they've done on spines, is that in that listening and in that questioning and in that re-meaning making that is constantly going on, we're actually evolving, making micro adjustments and understandings, is probably the better way to think of it, of what our culture is. And therefore, then, where and how creating spaces for other stories to emerge might actually also help the culture itself to move in more positive directions. Because obviously we do share something common. There is this layer that says we want our culture to be positive. I mean, who wants their culture to be negative? Who wants their culture to cause people not to perform well, not to have a vision of who their customers are, or what their products and services are, or what it feels like to be in that organization? Okay, so let's keep moving and see what we now can understand about this idea of volts. So story volts. We're talking now about voltage, which is a way in which we measure the force and movement of electricity itself. So look at this picture, and we can see that there are two open ends of the wire, right? They're not physically connected except through the force of the voltage that's moving through the circuit. And so really our stories are what allow the electricity, the potentiality, the energy to be unleashed within our organization. Now, the second point about what we know about voltage is that really voltage moves between two different points. So if there's a spot that is not activated, if you will, the voltage measures the difference between 2 points in that circuit, right? Where there's a low voltage versus a higher voltage. So we can actually measure voltage, and that's also what we're trying to do as we collect stories and curate stories, to understand really what is happening in the electricity of my organization. What are the dynamics at this point in time? And stories are really what we capture to get a handle on that. So we can certainly marry that up with data and other types of metrics that we might be using to measure certain initiatives which are tied to our culture. So if our organization is going through, let's say, some type of digital transformation, then we know that there are some hard metrics about user adoption. How are people taking on the new processes that are defining our organization? So we've got some of these change metrics, right, which are indirectly or directly aligned to culture. But then we can collect the qualitative, which is the potentiality, which are those stories, which also give us a sense of what's happening, what's the electricity, what are the dynamics. And the last thing we know about voltage is that, when you go to turn something off, there's often still a charge left in the circuit. So our culture is a set of circuits, and there's often electricity still in those circuits. So those, again, the stories give us a snapshot of where in the circuit is there energy. Okay, so I think we've established, hopefully, kind of what voltage and how that relates to story. So now, I apologize, we now get a little bit into some abstractions, which is the idea of field. And the field is just thinking of the organization as a fabric, and that within the organization, we have all of this and energy. And the energy is how people are feeling. It's what people are actually thinking about who and how they are in the organization. And all of those things, obviously, are artifacts about where and what our culture is. So the medium is, we separate in this idea the medium versus the field itself. So a field exists when a particular condition prevails, especially one in which a force, voltage, or influence is effective, regardless of the presence or absence of the medium. In other words, even if I'm not actively telling stories, there's story stuff happening in the organization, and that's all part of the field. So let's look at some different topologies really quickly. We know that when we try to push communication from a top-down perspective, we put across in every public area of our organization, or on all of our collaterals, or on the bottom of our emails, however you do it, you're putting the cultural messages that you want everyone to adopt because you've decided you wanted to act like X or Y. So that's really this idea of a top-down. Now, we've understood that there's a slightly better topology, and we see in organizations in the second picture of where there are subcultures. Now we've got the marketing department has its own little culture, and the marketing department will always have its own little subculture. So you're never going to kind of eliminate subcultures, but you still end up with this isolated. It's slightly better than the top-down kind of understanding of culture. But where we want to get to is the final picture over here, which is distributed or federated, which is the field, right? So now what we're doing is we're looking at, in this two-dimensional picture of a fabric, we're looking at the field of culture, of a storied culture in an organization. So just try to hold that as kind of what our goal is. And so much of what we do, we look at things like blockchain and other technologies that are a part now of how we're moving information and working with information. And that's a really good mirror of what are, I would say, basic principles, unseen principles of meaning and story that have been at work long before we had technology, which is things get distributed, right? They're federated. They're evenly moving in lots of different ways, the voltage across the activation and the potentialities in lots of areas, as opposed to top-down or just a peer-to-peer. So then we can introduce yet another kind of physics term, this idea of entanglement, which is, if we're going to have this distributed fabric, right? So if we're looking again at this distributed fabric, how is that possible that in one corner, the northwest corner can be as influential to the southeast corner, right? And that's this idea that there's really entanglement with our stories, and that a storied culture is benefiting from this idea that there is influence happening, again, whether we're actively pushing those stories. What have we done to potentiate the voltage of our networks of meaning in the organizations to establish the culture that we're after? So yet again, one more kind of electromagnetic physics term, and it's the idea that how is that happening in that distributed way? Where and how is that entanglement? Well, if we think of everything being part of a fabric, part of a field, then there has to be some force that's moving those things between the northwest corner and the southeast corner. And that's this idea that there are gravitational waves in our organizations. Okay, so two last ideas before we get to three brief case studies. Then I know we've got questions, so just want to be really mindful of time. You have to understand that in storytelling, it's all about the heart before the head. And it's also about the gut. There is more, and this has been proven. I'm not pulling these three facts that you see in front of you out of thin air. These are from lots of different sources of research. The heart has 40,000 neurons. Think about that. So there's more intelligence and more command central, more of the neutron, right? In the neutron is the heart of that atom, or the heart of that potentiality of that energy that we unleash, than in the brain itself. And the heart sends more information to the brain than it receives. So it's really kind of the center of our intelligence. And as long as we're talking about electromagnetic energy, we think of the brain, we know that the brain has energy, right? We can measure brain waves, and we can measure those with ECG, I can't even say what the C means, but basically we measure the energy that comes out of the brain. Did you know that the magnetic field of our hearts is 5 times more powerful than the brain? Think about that. So how are we tuning into this field, this voltage of stories, to create our distributed story cultures by enacting the powers of other people's hearts? Not, again, trying to control what is in their heart or how their heart is experiencing, but how are we activating the energy of the heart, because that's what's going to create that distributed network. And these are all of the intangibles. And folks, we all know that the intangibles are really, really real. Okay, I just want to give a shout out to one guy and one book that's just recently been published that I think has a lot to offer about how we even craft stories in what I would say are far more dynamic ways than many of us are accustomed to. And the book is called The Whole Language. Father Greg Boyle, yes, he is a Jesuit priest, and he dealt with the problem of gangs in Los Angeles. So in California and many parts of the United States, we have the sad issue of gangs, and gangs often are the only way out for people in some really, really tragic situations. So this book is a collection of his experiences. He created something called Homeboy Industries, and creates opportunities for these young men and women, both coming in and out of gangs and who have been in prison, and gives them opportunities to work in some of the businesses that he's created. So they've got a bakery, they've got a cafe, they have a dry cleaning business, they have a whole number of businesses. And so these young adults get opportunities to remake themselves. And the book is all his experiences of working with these kids. Now, the thing of it is, he never tells you the moral of any of his stories. And if you open up a page of the book, and we just didn't have time for me to do this, and understanding that we're working in multiple languages, I thought it would be a little challenging. But I encourage you, especially as you get past the first, say, 20, 30 pages of the book, every paragraph has at least one story. He moves from one story to the next. He's never telling you what to take from the stories, and yet he's stringing all of these stories and anecdotes together. So there's this constant voltage happening in his book, and it's all coming from his heart, from his experience. And so you leave the book having entered into his culture, and yet he's never really described or told you what the culture of Homeboy Industries is all about. So just want to kind of bring that up as a really rich example. Okay, let's enter into the first case study. Just checking my time here. So this was with a very, very large telecom company, And I was asked to develop a off-site leadership retreat for the C-suite. So we had the chief financial officer, we had head of HR, a whole number of very top-level people in the organization. And they were going to begin the process of defining the new culture. I said, well, you can't do that on your own. You can't just sit there and even look at the value that the business is trying to generate and say, here's what we need. You can't craft and architect it. It has to come bottom up. You have to listen to the voice of your employees. So what we did, what you're seeing there is the result of the opening of this workshop, which is we had spent time going around the organization collecting stories from the employees. And we had, of course, we had a specific story frame. We had a specific question, tell me about a time when, and we had several of these questions. And then we pieced it together into a little over 8-minute soundbite. And then what you see is that the people had to close their eyes or put on a face mask, an eye mask, and listen, immerse themselves in the voice of their employees who were sharing their experiences. And we weave together all of these experiences again in a very succinct narrative, also using their voices. And this led to a very rich conversation because as they began to think about what their business drivers were, they now understood how people felt in the organization and were able to enter into their shoes, and it became an anchoring point to some of the other story and meaning making that we did that was the building blocks for articulating their vision of the culture that they wanted to begin to socialize. Here's another example. I was working with a utility company, and we had a very elaborate set of interventions for managing the merger and acquisition and bringing the culture of these two organizations together. Now, quite frankly, I was getting frustrated because I realized that we were not moving the needle, that there was a lot of us versus them kind of mentality happening. People were not cooperating. I think one of the things that we had agreed, it was a very simple kind of metric, but we wanted to see that the two organizations, and we were looking at this point at the IT organizations, were actually beginning to collaborate with one another. And we were measuring that by, the number of meetings they were having, when they were working on shared and joint projects, when they were drawing from the other company, quote unquote, other companies' expertise in IT and again, pulling them into their projects. So this was a utility company, and I realized that every time there was a bad winter storm, they had all hands on deck. So many people, it didn't matter what your role was, would actually go out into the neighborhoods where there were live wires. Funny, we're talking about electricity again. There were live wires down because a tree had made that power wire fall, and therefore there was a danger. And so what they had to do was go out in cars and keep the customers safe, try to keep them away from the wires. So I said, that's brilliant. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to force people from the two separate organizations to have to get in the same car and spend 2-3 hours in the freezing cold with their cup of coffee, maybe a donut. And what's going to happen? They're going to have a shared experience. And the shortest distance between two people, I always say, is a story. They're going to have to begin to get to know one another. It seems so simple. You're like, Terrence, what does that have to do with culture? Well, remember, one of the things that we were driving towards culturally was collaboration. When these had their shared experience, they got to know one another because they're stuck in the car. And naturally, you're going to begin sharing experiences, not just the one that's happening to you in the moment, but ones from your past, your stories. They begin to create a connection and bond with one another. And that's exactly what happened. And then we saw things like a database administrator sharing that, hey, I'm really having a problem with the performance of this application, and I can't see that there's any problem with the database. And someone from the other company saying, hey, I'm a network engineer. let me come by and bring a protocol analyzer. That's basically something that looks at all these different technology stacks of what's used to create, communication between applications and all the pieces of an application, without getting too technical. And maybe there's some traffic coming in front of your database server that's causing the problems. So they began collaborating, and we were able to measure that. I think I've got, Artem, do I have time for the one last example? Oh, I think I should just jump to the 3 storied strategies, and then get to questions, because I think we're just down to 10 minutes. Is that correct? Jump in here. Okay, I don't hear Artem, but
yes,
yeah.
It's okay. I'm just texting you
Okay.
in the chat.
Oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't looking at it. Okay.
All right.
So I'll just jump to, I think, this slide, Artem, and then make room for the questions. And maybe in answering the questions, I can refer to the last case study. So let me just give you kind of 3 storied strategies to create this voltage. How do you do this? And my thoughts are that, 1, create orchestrated, unstructured opportunities for people to share their stories. So you can see in that case study, in this case, it was getting people in cars. So there's lots of ways that you can do that. Many companies now, as they, are working virtually, we've got to find different ways of doing this. In the past, we would actually create physical spaces and times where people could come together. So, look for things that are orchestrated but unstructured. Designate and design specific physical spaces that promote informal and extemporaneous interactions. And again, I think there are ways of doing this virtual, and I think video can be a real new, interesting tool for us to use, particularly if you put appropriate constraints around what people are offering in their video and keeping them very short. Make the ongoing development of relationship skills and communication competencies as your top learning priority throughout all levels of the organization. And as we answer the questions, jump into the questions now, I'll just leave up this slide, which these are some techniques. And if you go out to my website, you'll even find some free resources out there. I certainly can, share stuff. There are different techniques for harvesting stories for the work that you want to do. So, and these are just some of the different techniques. And I think people during the conference have probably shared things like story circles and some other techniques with you. But anyway, Artem, let's jump to the questions.
Terrence, thank you so much. Guys, if you have questions, please write them to the chat. I know Terrence has lots and lots to tell more, and it's just so great to see you explore this metaphor. And so here's Tatiana asking you to explore more about story ambassadors. Can you tell us about that?
Story ambassadors. So this actually came about when I was working with a cruise line, and what they realized was that they were trying to create better efficiencies and understand where there were some operational issues. So what we began to do is train everyone on the cruise ship, whether it was this person who cleans the room to the person who's acting as the maitre d' for your offshore excursions, and all of them became observers of stories. So we developed their story observation, meaning what are you observing that's happening, and then give me a data point, and the data point being I saw a customer with his family and they were doing X, or I observed Y. So they put these into short narratives. So creating ambassadors in your organization who are looking to observe around, let's say collaboration is a cultural value that you're trying to promote. Well, then train up some people to actually become observers and to see where, when, and how, and if that's happening in the organization, and also where it's not happening, and bring back those have a way of bringing back those stories, concatenate them, meaning connect them all into a bigger narrative that then you can share with leadership if they're the ones that are, kind of managing or monitoring that as a key cultural value.
Thank you so much. I can see that we are waiting for more questions. And while we are, we are not anymore. So Paul is writing, in the example of listening and feeling stories with eyes closed, how was it in practice to record the voice of the employees? Was there any resistance regarding being recorded?
Oh, well, wonderful. Actually, we did the recording, but we captured the stories. And again, it's always the ethics of storytelling are absolutely important. So everyone has to know what's going to happen with their stories. You have to have the permission. You have to invite them, and then you have to make sure that you also follow up so that they see what that end result is. Now, you may need to constrain and say, hey, you're not going to be part of the review cycle to say, no, this is not going to be used, because you've got practicalities of a timeline and you have to get something done. So you have to set those expectations, but you have to manage the life cycle of their story, and also let them know how others responded to their story. So if they're not, in this case, these folks were not present in the room, we went back to them and shared out the responses, the reactions of these leaders to their stories. So really make sure that you're looking at the whole process from beginning to end, and always keep the ethics of the story at heart.
Awesome. Thank you so much. One more from Trester. What's your favorite entailment of the Walt metaphor? That's continuation, I guess, right?
Yeah. I'm still learning from this voltage, because again, I'm not a deep scientist, and I think what really got me was this idea of distribution, was this idea that there is potentiality even when this seems like the circuit is turned off. So we often feel like we have to be doing something in order to be promoting the culture, versus not understanding that stuff is happening all the time. Now, what we may need to do, which goes back to Story Ambassador or all these different harvesting techniques, is we need to make sure that we're listening. So we know, let me go back to a network example. We know that we have to measure and monitor the health of a network with telemetry, which are basically devices that we put that are listening all the time to see, is the network up and running? Is it healthy? Is it working? And that's what enables us to dynamically, do things in the background that no one sees, to ensure that, like right now, my video is still coming through, and it's going across the globe to, Russia and all the other wonderful places that people are sitting. We don't see that. So that's the work that often that we have to do as story culture, leaders, is have that telemetry. And so to answer again the question, I really was taken by this idea that the voltage is in the circuit, whether it's in the north or southeast corner, potentiating all the time. I kind of understood that, but when I thought about it from the standpoint of electricity, it was it really pushed my thinking. Great question.
And Chester also loves your answer, just like Paulo. So thank you so much. It's been lovely to see you and hear you reflect on this metaphor. And I especially love the bit where you said that two wires shouldn't be connected to transmit energy, which is really essential, I guess, in the digital world we are living in right now, because we are clearly not connected, and yet still we have this energy going on. So it's not fire, it's electricity.
It's heart. And just like your heart of holding this conference in challenging times, and the response of hearts of wanting to participate in wanting to share whatever I'm able to share of value with anyone else, there's that 5,000 times more powerful than the brain, right? We've created the field. And I know you have that final question. I don't know.
Yes. Final.
All right, bring it on.
I'm going at it one last time. So culture builds the stories we live and tell, and stories shape the culture. So what came first, culture or story?
You know how I'm going to answer this, Octo. Yes, you do. Neither. Because the field, now we can go back to the metaphor. I was so happy you were going to ask this, you see, because it allows me to tie it all back together. What's this notion of the field? And again, we just have learned from these linear accelerators like the Higgs boson, right? This field. So what's the field? There's something that is ontological, meaning before the story and the culture itself. And that's love. And it comes back again to the heart and to the intention. Remember, organizations, yes, are an inorganic entity. They have efficiency and profitability at their core. Now, we know that there are other things that we can balance, and it really is about balancing. I don't buy into anyone saying, oh, we can create the organization that only is about the... No. An organization, like any animal, has its own physical DNA and characteristics. And an organization does have to think about its efficiency and some way of generating, value consistently in order to survive. Otherwise, it's not that animal. We balance it with then being philanthropic and caring about our employees and all these other wonderful things that are absolutely essential and important and things that we care about, right? But the answer to your question is it's neither the story nor the culture, because what comes first is the field that then allows the voltage of the stories and the culture to sort of co-emerge from this field. So what kind of field do we want to create? Do we want to create a destructive one, in which case you're going to end up with a topology like the first picture with the top down, or maybe at best the peer-to-peer, or do we want that distributed fabric whereby there's positivity, there's growth, people are being able to be their full selves within this entity, within this animal that has its own DNA. So that's my answer.
Awesome. I'll take that for an answer.
All right.
Since you're the one closing us, and I'll take that. Guys, let's bring our fire. We cannot bring volts. We can bring fire to Terrence for his amazing last speech. Thank you so much for joining us this year especially.
My joy.
Thank you. All right. It's been a wild ride. And it's a pity. I remember last year at the end of the conference, I felt the same, just like I feel right now, because I hate to say goodbye, and I hate to say recording will be available in June, la-di-da, join the Telegram chat, recordings will be there. Instead, I'll share with you a story. I hope you like it. So, this winter, I was in a car with my son, and we went to a swimming pool. Every Sunday we went to the swimming pool, and this Sunday was not an exception. So we come to the swimming pool, and I am driving a Volkswagen Golf, which is a pretty basic car, and I'm driving, and the snow is all around, and I make a mistake. I get stuck in the snow, and I try wiggling back and forth, but I'm a lousy driver. I have like 2 years of experience, and pretty soon I feel that the tires touch the ice under the snow. There's no chance I can move this thing. I open the door, and the alleyway I'm stuck in is so narrow that I cannot open the door, so I have to slide the snow down under the car, and it's just I'm nervous, I'm anxious. I cannot tolerate being late. I'm not that kind of person. But that's an exception because I feel that I'm being late, and I am sitting down in my car, and I'm saying to my son, who is sitting next to me, I'm saying, Kostya, I'm going to go out there and try to push the car. So I go out there, and I try and push the car, but then I realized I forgot to take it off the parking when we stopped. So you can get my level of driving at that point. So I get back in the car and I open the door and I put it to neutral and I hear my son say, Papa, don't be afraid. Don't be worried. I will help you. He's 3 years old. He's 1 meter high. He gets out of the car and he tries to push. And I'm looking at him and he's fabulous. He's wonderful. He's pushing with me. And I'm trying to not overload him because it's a heavy car. I mean, come on. But then we sit down back in the car and I say, Kostya, I don't know what to do. I'm in tears and I'm like, no, not literally, but and he says, Papa, don't worry. A special car with a hook. It will come and save us. And then I get this idea. I dial the phone. I Google it for some place, and I find the phone of the guys with the special car. I don't even know the name of it in English. So and they say to me that like it's half an hour or 40 minutes. So we are late already. I sit down and he says, well, yeah, tow truck, right? Thank you. So while waiting for the tow truck, says my son, why don't we watch some cartoons? And he's absolutely calm. He's peaceful. He's not nervous. He's not saying, I want my swimming pool. He's just so relaxed and so joyful. And I mean, like, I'm sitting there with my son. We're watching cartoons. I can remember to this day we were watching Smishariki. For our Russian audience, you will understand. So the tow truck comes and it pulls us out. And then we're totally late for swimming pool. But we get to the parking lot, and after we park, I turn to my son and I say, Kostya, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to you. In this moment, Kostya turns to me and says, what are you grateful for, Dad? And I see in his eyes that he's not yet able to make me use flattery and explain and like pretend that he doesn't understand. He genuinely doesn't understand what am I grateful for. And in that moment I realized that the minute we stop thanking people for what they do, this will be the moment we stop building the cultures we want. So instead of just telling stories, I want to offer you this invitation. Next time you see somebody in an organization or wherever do something you want more of in this world, maybe being tolerant or nice or sympathetic, empathetic, or just human, I want you to thank this person, because in that moment you will be writing the final chapter of his story that will make a meaning for this person, and he will continue doing that. I think if every one of us does this for at least once a day, our world will be beautiful because we will storify it together. And that said, I want to thank you all for being here, because there is no story without a listener, hence there is no conference without the conference participants. I want to thank you all from the bottom of my heart, and I want to ask you for one last time, let's light this fire as big as we can, tap it as much and as fast as you can so it can burn the brightest. And thank you all for being here this year. You were amazing. No, you were amazing. And thank you for our translators. You are brilliant, girls. I mean, I'm standing applauding here. You are awesome. Thank you all. And, well, stay safe, everyone. Till next time, cheers.